The morning Barrett handed me the final papers, the coffee was already made. I remember that clearly because I had poured it myself at 5:30 the way I had poured it every morning of our 42 years together. And the steam was still rising when he sat down across from me in his navy cashmere robe and slid the manila folder across the granite island. I was 69 years old. The sun was just coming up over Lake Michigan, turning the high windows of our North Shore condominium a kind of soft apricot. And outside somewhere a single gull was calling, and I thought how strange that a sound so ordinary can feel like a bell tolling for a life you did not know was ending. He did not look at me when he spoke. He looked at the folder. He said, "Willa, I have signed them. I have been more than fair. Vivian and I would like to proceed without further delay." His voice had the slightly rehearsed quality of a man who had practiced the sentence in the mirror, and I noticed he used the word proceed the way a judge uses it, as though our marriage had become a matter of procedure, a file to be closed, a thing to be moved off a desk and into storage. I did not answer right away. I picked up my coffee. I felt my hand, and I want to tell you something true about that hand, because it matters to the whole rest of the story. My hand did not shake. I had expected it to. I had braced for it the way you brace for a wave when you wade out too far into the lake, but the wave did not come. My hand lifted the cup, and my mouth drank the coffee, and somewhere inside my chest, a small, steady voice that I had not heard in a very long time said, "Willa Lindquist, you will not shake in front of this man, not today, not ever again." I set the cup down. I opened the folder. I read the top page slowly, the way my grandmother had taught me to read any document. That required a signature with a finger moving under every line. Dissolution of marriage. Equitable distribution. The words sat on the page like stones. The condo was his because the deed had always been in his name, a tax thing he had explained to me once in 1984, in a tone that did not invite questions. The cabin in Door County was his because his father had left it to him. The retirement accounts were his because the law in Illinois treats certain contributions in a certain way. And his attorney, I could see, had worked very hard on the certain way. I was to receive what they called a transitional allowance, which was a polite phrase for a sum of money that would keep me from becoming an embarrassment at the country club for about 14 months. $23,000. I read it twice to be sure I had understood. 42 years. $23,000. I closed the folder. The kitchen was very quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear Barrett breathing across the island. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, slow and steady. And I thought, this is what it sounds like when a life ends not with a crash, but with a hum. I said, "Barrett." He looked up finally. His eyes were blue and a little watery, and for the first time I saw that he was afraid of me, or afraid of this moment, or afraid of something that lived behind this moment. And I thought, oh, you poor man, you have made yourself smaller to fit beside a woman half your age. and you did not even notice yourself shrinking. I said, I will not contest it. He blinked. He had expected a scene. 42 years of marriage, and he thought he knew what I would do. He had probably rehearsed responses to my anger, my tears, my pleading. And perhaps the saddest thing in the whole apartment that morning was the realization that he did not know me at all. He had lived with me for 42 years, and he had never once looked closely enough to see who I actually was. I said, I will sign them by Friday. I will be out of the apartment in 3 weeks. Please do not call me during that time. Please ask Vivian not to call me. If there is anything further, it can go through your attorney to mine. Then I took my coffee into the sunroom and I sat in the wingback chair my mother had given me for our wedding, and I watched the gull on the railing until it flew away. The chair was upholstered in a fabric the color of moss, and it had sat in this room for 42 years, and I had nursed Marigold in it, and I had read 1,000 books in it. And now I sat in it and looked out at the lake, and I did not cry. Not then. I do not want you to think I was made of stone, because I was not. And the crying came later in pieces over months in a farmhouse kitchen, and on a screen porch, and once beside a flooded bog with a wooden scoop in my hands. But that morning I was hollowed out and very quiet, and in the quiet I heard for the first time in 4 decades the sound of my own thinking. And my own thinking said one clear word. It said, Warrens. The discovery came 6 weeks earlier on a Tuesday evening in late February, when the wind off the lake was rattling the windows and Barrett was working late, or said he was working late. I had learned by then that late meant different things to different people. And to Barrett, in the winter of his 70th year late, meant a woman named Vivian, who worked at his law firm and who wore her ambition like perfume. I found the messages on his phone. He had left it on the kitchen counter while he showered, which was either carelessness or a kind of unconscious confession. The way a man who wants to be caught leaves the evidence where it can be found. I had picked it up, meaning only to move it to wipe down the counter, and the screen had lit up with a notification that began, "Missing you already, can't wait for Friday." I stood in the kitchen with his phone in my hand, and the steam from the shower drifting out from the bathroom down the hall. And I thought, well, here it is, the thing you have been not seeing for 6 months. The thing you have been stepping around like a hole in the floor, telling yourself it is just a shadow, just a trick of the light. I scrolled. I should not have, but I did. The messages went back to September. Dinner reservations, hotel confirmations, photographs. I will not describe here because they do not belong to this story, except to say that they were the kind of photographs a man sends to a woman he is trying to convince that he is still vital, still dangerous, still worth the risk. I set the phone down exactly where I had found it. I walked into the bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I waited, and when Barrett came out of the bathroom in his towel, with his hair combed back and his reading glasses in his hand, I said, "Who is Vivian?" He stopped in the doorway. The light from the bathroom backlit him, and I could see the outline of his body thinner than it had been when we married, the shoulders less broad, and I thought, when did he start to look old? And why did I not notice? He did not ask how I knew. He did not pretend not to understand. He said, "Willa." Just that. My name. Like an apology that had not yet found its words. I said, "Who is she, Barrett?" He set his glasses on the dresser. He sat down in the chair by the window. He did not look at me. He said, "She is a junior partner. She is 34. She is someone who understands what I am trying to build at the firm." I said, "And I do not understand." He said, "You have not understood in a long time, Willa. You have been content to live in this apartment and go to your book club and plan your garden, and that is fine. That is your life, but it is not mine anymore." The thing that struck me in that moment was not his cruelty, though it was cruel. It was the fact that he believed what he was saying. He believed I had chosen contentment, the way you choose a paint color, casually without consequence. And he did not remember, or had chosen not to remember, that in 1984, when he made partner and said we needed to move to Chicago, and said I needed to stop working so I could support him properly, I had said yes. I had said yes because that was what a wife did. I had given up my nursing license. I had packed our daughter's toys into boxes. I had smiled at the partners' wives and learned to make conversation about fundraisers and vacation homes and the right preschool. And I had told myself that this was marriage. This was what you did for the person you loved. I had told myself that supporting meant stepping back. That love meant making myself smaller so he could be larger. And now, sitting on the edge of our bed in the apartment I did not own, looking at a man I had spent 42 years believing I knew, I understood that I had been wrong. Not about marriage, about him. I said, "Barrett, I gave you 42 years. He said, "I know." I said, "I gave you our daughter. I gave you every dinner party and every Christmas, and every lie I told myself when you worked late. I gave you my career and my name in the town I grew up in." He said, "Willa, you are being dramatic." I stood up. I walked to the dresser. I looked at him in the mirror and I said, "Tell me the truth. Please. Just once. Do you love her, or do you just love that she makes you feel like you are not 70? He was quiet for a long time. The wind rattled the windows. The radiator clicked. Then he said, "I love that she does not make me feel like I am already dead." I nodded. I turned around. I said, "Then you should be with her. You should pack your things and go be with her tonight. And we should call our attorneys in the morning and figure out what fair looks like." He said, "Willa." I said, "Do not say my name again like that. Like I am something you are trying to soothe. I am not your patient. I am not your problem. I am the woman you married, and I am telling you that if you want to leave, you should leave." He stood up. He walked to the closet. He said without turning around, "The condo is in my name. The retirement accounts are mine. The cabin is mine. This is my life, Willa. I built it." And there it was. The thing he had been building toward for 6 weeks, maybe for 6 years, maybe for all 42 years without either of us quite seeing it. The reminder that I had nothing, that I was nothing, that I existed in his life at his discretion. And if he chose to withdraw that discretion, I would find myself 69 years old with a suitcase and $23,000 and no clear idea of what came next. I said very quietly, "Then I suppose we know what fair looks like." He turned around. He said, "Willa, I did not mean—" I said, "Yes, you did. You meant exactly that. And I am grateful you said it now instead of in front of a lawyer where I might have believed you when you pretended to be generous." I walked to the door. I stopped. I said, "Barrett, when you are alone in this condo with Vivian and she is 36 and you are 72 and she starts to look at younger men, the way you looked at her, I hope you remember this conversation. I hope you remember that you told a woman who gave you everything that she had nothing. I hope it keeps you awake." Then I walked out and I closed the door and I went to sleep in the guest room with my phone turned off and my heart beating so hard I thought I might be sick. But I was not sick. I was awake. For the first time in 42 years, I was awake. The next 6 weeks passed in a strange slow motion, like living underwater. Barrett moved out 3 days after our conversation. He took his clothes and his books and his father's portrait, and he did not say goodbye. I hired a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had hard eyes and a gentle voice, and who told me on our first meeting that Illinois law would not be kind to me. She was right. I attended mediation sessions in conference rooms that smelled of coffee and desperation, and I listened to Barrett's attorney explain in careful detail why I was entitled to very little. And I signed papers and I nodded and I did not fight. Patricia asked me more than once if I was sure. She said, "Willa, you could contest this. You could ask for more. You gave up your career for this marriage." I said, "I know, but I do not want more. I want to be done." And I meant it. I did not want to spend the next year of my life in courtrooms arguing about who deserved what piece of a marriage that had been dead for longer than either of us had admitted. I wanted to be done. I wanted to be free. 3 weeks later, I packed the Volvo wagon. It was a 2011 model Hunter Green with 104,000 miles on it, and a scratch on the back bumper from the time I had backed into a grocery cart in Evanston in the rain. Barrett had always called it my car, dismissively the way men do when they want you to know that the real car, the Mercedes in the garage, was his. I was glad of the Volvo that morning. I loaded it with what I wanted to take and I left behind what I did not. And I was surprised at how little I wanted. I took my clothes, not all of them, just the warm things and the practical things because, Where I was going would not need silk or pearls or the black dress I had worn to 42 years of firm dinners. I took my mother's cast iron skillet and my grandmother's copper jam pan. I took a cardboard box of photograph albums because photographs are the only thing in a divorce that belong equally to both people and to neither. And I had decided I would keep the ones that told the truth about my life, which turned out to be the ones from before I met Barrett and the ones of my daughter. I took 3 houseplants, a jade, and 2 African violets wrapped in damp newspaper in a laundry basket on the passenger seat. I took my good reading glasses and my cheap reading glasses and a cardigan the color of oatmeal that Marigold had knitted for me the winter she was 19. I did not take the wedding china. I did not take the silver. I did not take the portrait of Barrett's father that had hung over our mantel since 1981. I did not take the crystal bowl from the Heminger wedding because it was not mine to take. I left a note on the kitchen counter that said, "Barrett, the key is on the hook. The alarm code is your mother's birthday as you requested. There is a pot roast in the freezer. Please eat it before it turns. W." I read it twice. I did not sign it with love. I did not sign it with anything but my initial because love had been a word we had used for 42 years, without I now realized ever quite agreeing on what it meant. I locked the door. I walked to the elevator. The doorman, a young man named Marcus, whose wife had just had a baby girl, carried my last suitcase down to the car. And when he set it in the trunk, he looked at me for a long moment and he said, "Mrs. Morrison, are you well?" And I said, "Marcus, I am going home." He nodded. He said, "Safe roads." He did not ask where home was. I was grateful. The drive from Chicago to Warrens, Wisconsin is about 4 hours if the weather is kind, which it was that April morning with a thin blue sky and the kind of cold sunlight that makes the last snow on the fields look like spilled milk. I took I-94 up through Milwaukee and then I cut northwest on 90 and somewhere around the Dells I began to cry. Not hard, just a steady leaking the way a cheap faucet leaks in the night. I did not pull over. I let the tears run and I let the road run and I let the radio play an old Peggy Lee song I had forgotten I knew. The song was about fever, about the heat of desire. And I thought how strange to be 69 and driving away from the only man you have ever kissed and feeling nothing like fever feeling instead, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. And by the time I saw the first sign for Warrens, my face was dry and the sun was halfway down the sky. Warrens is not a large town. The sign on the highway says, population 400 and change. And in October, when the Cranberry Festival comes, the whole county swells up and the streets fill, and the marshes blaze red and gold. But in April, it is a quiet place, a scatter of houses and a grocery and a feed store, and a diner called the Cranberry Cup. And around it for miles in every direction lie the bogs, rectangle after rectangle. Some flooded, some dry, some tended, some gone to willow. I drove through the town slowly. I knew the way, even though I had not driven it in 11 years. Grandmother Brigitta's house sat 3 miles out of town, on a gravel road called Lindquist Lane, which was not named for her exactly, but for her father-in-law who had come over from Gothenburg in 1902 with nothing but a sack of seed and a letter of introduction to a Danish man in Monroe County. The lane turned at an old silver maple and dipped down through a stand of tamarack and then opened up, and there it was. I pulled the Volvo into the dirt drive and put it in park, and I sat for a long time with my hands on the wheel. The house was a century-old red clapboard farmhouse, 2 stories with a steep roof and a brick chimney, and a screen porch that sagged on the south side from rust, and the porch steps were softer than I remembered, and the scoop shed beyond the house leaned to the east like a drunk leaning into a wind, and past the shed down a short slope the old bog lay in its rectangles. 40 acres of dormant vines the color of dried blood, divided by raised earthen dikes, with a little wooden sluice gate at the far end, where the creek came through. The wild apple orchard on the north side of the house had gone half feral, but I could see already where the blossoms would come in May. I got out of the car. I stood in the gravel. The air smelled of cedar and melting snow and something faintly acidic that was the bog itself breathing. And I thought, I am 69 years old, and I did not know I was homesick. I did not know I had been homesick for 11 years and possibly for 42. The key was under the 3rd flower pot on the porch, where my cousin Lars had told me it would be. The lock turned hard. The door swung open onto the smell of cedar and old wool, and faintly of mice, and the afternoon light came through the west window and laid itself down on the pine floorboards in a long golden stripe. And I stepped inside, and I was home. The first thing I saw was Grandmother Brigitta's crocheted afghan folded over the back of the sofa. It was cream and rust and the color of new butter worked in a granny square pattern, and she had finished it the winter I was 10, and she had told me then, "Willa, this is for when you are old and the world is cold." I had forgotten she had said that. I remembered it now, standing in her parlor with my purse still on my shoulder. And I went to the sofa, and I picked up the afghan, and I held it against my face, and it smelled of cedar, because she had always kept her wool in a cedar chest. And the smell of cedar is the smell of a woman who planned to outlast her wool. And I sat down on the sofa and I held the afghan in my lap and I looked around. The parlor had not changed. The rag rug was the rag rug braided from strips of worn dresses and aprons. The colors faded to the soft palette of old photographs. The upright piano was the upright piano, its keys yellow as old corn. The bookcase held the same water-damaged atlas and the same dog-eared copy of Kristin Lavransdatter and the same row of Ladies' Home Journal from 1962. On the wall above the piano hung the photograph. It was black and white, 8 by 10 in a plain wooden frame, and it showed my grandmother Brigitta Lindquist in 1957. Standing knee-deep in a flooded bog in rubber waders, her hair in a kerchief, her hands on a wooden scoop, and she was laughing. She was 44 that year. She had just lost my grandfather to a heart attack the previous November, and she had run the bog alone that fall. And the man who took the photograph was the county extension agent, and he had put it in the Warrens Weekly under the caption, A widow brings in the crop. I had always loved that caption. I had not understood it until that afternoon. I stood up. I walked through the house. The kitchen still had the green linoleum I remembered cracked now along the seam by the stove. The pantry still had mason jars on the top shelf. Empty, dusty, waiting. The back bedroom still had the iron bed with the quilt my great-aunt Ingrid had pieced in 1939, a log cabin pattern in blues and browns. The upstairs smelled of dry wasps and sun-warmed pine, and a single bumblebee came in through a gap in the window screen and bumped against the glass, and went out again. And I laughed because it was the first laughing sound I had made in 3 weeks, and it surprised me like a sneeze. I did not sleep in the iron bed that first night. I did not have the strength to carry the suitcase up the stairs, and I did not have the strength to make the bed, and I did not frankly have the strength to be upstairs alone in a house I had not slept in for 11 years. I pulled the crocheted afghan over me on the parlor sofa. I ate a piece of cheese and an apple I had brought in the car. I listened to the sound of the house settling around me, the creak of the ridge beam, the soft tick of the kitchen clock, which had somehow kept running on a battery someone must have changed long after my grandmother died. And I listened to the spring peepers start up in the ditch by the road, and I fell asleep with my shoes still on because I could not be bothered to untie them. I woke once in the dark. I did not know where I was. For one long blank moment I thought I was in the condo, and I reached out for Barrett the way you reach without thinking, and my hand found the edge of the afghan instead. And I remembered. I did not cry. I did not go back to sleep quickly. I lay in the dark and listened to the frogs. And I thought, Willa, you are alone in a house that is all you are alone in a house, and the house is not afraid of you. And you are not afraid of the house, and that is more than many women your age can say tonight. And then I slept. The next morning, the sun came through the east window and woke me at 6. And I lay on the sofa under the afghan and looked at the ceiling and thought about what comes next. I was 69 years old. I had $23,000 in a checking account that Barrett's attorney had opened for me with the kind of brisk efficiency that made it clear this was a transaction, not a kindness. I had a Volvo wagon with 104,000 miles. I had a farmhouse I did not own, though my cousin Lars had made it clear in his careful Scandinavian way that it was mine to use as long as I needed it, and perhaps longer if I wanted to work out the taxes. I had 40 acres of cranberry bog that had not been harvested in 11 years, and I had for the first time in my adult life no one to answer to, no one to cook for, no one to organize my days around. And the freedom of that was so large and so terrifying that I had to get up and walk to the kitchen just to prove to myself that I could. I made coffee in the old percolator on the stove. I found a can of grounds in the freezer that was probably 5 years old, and I did not care. The coffee tasted like memory, like mornings in this kitchen when I was 8. And my grandmother was making breakfast, and the radio was playing polka music from a station in Marshfield. I took my cup out to the screen porch. The boards were soft under my feet, and the screens were torn in places, and there was a wasp nest in the far corner that I would have to deal with eventually. But the morning was cold and clean, and the light on the bog was the color of pewter. And I thought, well, Willa, here you are. Here you are at the end of one life and the beginning of something else. And you do not yet know what that something else is. But you are here. And the coffee is hot, and the bog is still breathing. And that is enough for now. I spent that first full day doing small things. I swept the kitchen floor. I washed the dishes that had been left in the cupboard dusty and strange. I opened all the windows on the first floor to let the April air move through. I found a broom in the pantry closet, and I swept the parlor and the hallway, and I did not think about Barrett or Vivian, or the condo or the things I had left behind. I thought about my hands and the broom and the dust moving in the light. I thought about how strange it was that physical work could make you feel more present in your own body, more real, more here. In the afternoon, I walked down to the bog. The path from the house was overgrown with wild raspberry canes, and I had to push through them carefully. And when I came out on the edge of the first rectangle, I stood for a long time just looking. 40 acres. That is what my grandmother had worked alone after my grandfather died. 40 acres of cranberry vines planted in neat rectangles divided by earthen dikes that were wide enough to walk on, high enough to hold back the water when the bog was flooded for harvest. The vines were dormant now, a low mat of woody stems and dead leaves, dark red-brown, like old blood, like rust, like the color of something that has been left too long in the weather. But here and there I could see green, new growth, tiny leaves unfurling. The vines were alive. I knelt down at the edge of the dike, and I put my hand on the vines, and I thought, you have been here waiting. You have been here all this time, and no one has touched you, and you are still here. I stayed there until the light began to change, until the pewter turned to gold, and then to something softer. And then I walked back to the house, and I made myself a sandwich, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about my grandmother, Brigitta Lindquist, born in 1913 in a farmhouse 2 miles from here, married at 22 to a man who worked the bogs and taught her everything he knew, widowed at 44 when he dropped dead of a heart attack while checking the sluice gate on a November morning, left with 40 acres and a mortgage and a daughter married and gone, and a choice, sell or stay. She stayed. She ran the bog alone for 26 years. She died in 2013 at the age of 99 in the back bedroom upstairs with the quilt her sister had made. And the last thing she said to my cousin Lars, who was holding her hand, was, "Tell Willa the trunk is in the shed." I had not understood what she meant. Lars had mentioned it at the funeral, but I was deep in the fog of my own life then, deep in the performance of being Barrett Morrison's wife, and I had nodded and said I would come back and look, and I never had. And now, sitting in her kitchen, I thought the trunk is in the shed. What trunk I did not know, but I thought I might go look. Josette came the next morning. I had not called her. I had written her a letter 3 weeks before from the condo, telling her what was happening and where I was going and that I would be all right. And Josette Brandenburg, who had been my friend since our first week of nursing school in Milwaukee in 1975, had read that letter and had not written back because writing back was not her way. Her way was to put a pan of cornbread and a change of clothes and her reading glasses in a canvas bag and drive 3 hours north and park her Buick behind my Volvo at 8:15 in the morning and walk up onto the sagging porch and knock. I opened the door in my bathrobe. I had not brushed my hair. She looked at me. She said, "Willa Lindquist, you are a sight." I said, "Josette Brandenburg, you are a blessing." She said, "I brought cornbread." I said, "Come in." She came in and she set the cornbread on the kitchen table, still warm through the foil. And she looked around the kitchen and she said, "Girl, this is gonna take some work." And I said, "I know." And she said, "Well, I brought enough clothes for 2 months. Is that too long?" And I sat down on a kitchen chair and I put my face in my hands and I cried. And Josette put her hand on the back of my neck, the way she had done in 1976, when my first patient had died on my shift, and she did not say anything at all. She just stood there, with her hand on my neck and let me cry. And when I was finished, she handed me a napkin and she cut us each a square of cornbread and she said, "Now let us see what we are working with." What we were working with was a 100-year-old farmhouse that had been mostly closed up for 11 years, ever since my grandmother's second cousin had finished up the estate and handed the keys to Lars. And Lars had not known what to do with it and had simply paid the taxes and let it sit. The roof was sound, which was the mercy of the whole thing. The well ran. The pump worked. The septic tank had been inspected in 2019 for reasons I never fully understood. But Josette said we should not question Providence. But the screen porch was a hazard. The kitchen linoleum was lifting. The back bedroom window had a pane cracked by a fallen branch. The gutters were full of maple samaras turned to pulp, and a family of mice had made a confederation in the pantry that required Josette said a treaty rather than a war. We began with the screen porch. On the second day, a man came up the drive in a pickup truck and got out and stood looking at the porch with his hands on his hips. He was in his 70s, tall and lean with white hair and a weathered face, and he wore canvas pants and a flannel shirt and boots that had seen a lot of weather. He said, "Brigida's granddaughter, is that right?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I am Otis Holmesburg, Van your neighbor down the lane. I am sorry for your grandmother. She was a fine woman. She made the best sour cherry preserves in the county." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Well, let us put a shoulder to this porch before it decides for us." And he went back to his truck and came back with a claw hammer and a box of galvanized screws and a Tupperware container of pickled beets. And for the next 3 days, he and Josette and I tore out the rotten boards and brace the joists and put up new screens, and we did not talk much while we worked. But the work itself was a kind of conversation. Otis Holmesburg Van was 76, a widower, a retired Cranberry Cooperative manager, Norwegian on his father's side and German on his mother's, and he had lived on the next property for 51 years. He knew every dike and every sluice and every neighbor and every squabble, and he had the gift that very old country men have of arriving at your house precisely when you needed him and leaving precisely before you grew tired of him. He did not say much. When he did say something, it mattered. On the third day of porch work, as we were nailing new screen onto the freshly braced frame, he said, without looking at me, "Willa, you know the bog is grandfathered." I said, "I am sorry." He said, "The bog. Your grandmother's bog. It is grandfathered into the Warrens Farm Registry, 1948. No permit required to restart. If the vines are alive, and some of them are, you can bring it back." I stopped nailing. I looked at him. He looked at the screen. He said, "Just so you know." I nodded. I did not say anything. I nailed the next staple with care. He went home for lunch and did not come back that afternoon, and I stood on the newly rebuilt porch and looked down across the yard at the dormant rectangles of the bog, and I felt for the first time in a long time that something in my chest was interested in tomorrow. The days took on a shape. Josette made coffee at 6. I made breakfast. We worked until lunch on whatever the house needed. We took the afternoon slower. She stayed 2 months. Understand, Josette was not a woman who had time to spare. She had 2 grown sons and 4 grandchildren, and a part-time job at the free clinic in Milwaukee, and a husband named Reuben who had retired from the post office and who required, as she put it, a certain level of managerial oversight. But she called Reuben that first morning from my kitchen, and I heard her say, "Reuben, I am staying with Willa. I do not know for how long. Figure it out. Do not call me about the recycling. I love you." And then she hung up and she cut us each a square of cornbread, and she said, "Now let us see what we are working with." What we worked with was stubbornness and YouTube videos, and the kind of practical wisdom that comes from having survived nursing shifts in understaffed hospitals in the 1980s. We learned to replace linoleum. We learned to patch window screens. We learned that mice respond better to negotiation than to poison, which meant setting humane traps and releasing them down by the creek, and accepting that some percentage would return, which Josette said was the price of living in the country. In the evenings we read. I read my grandmother's canning journal, which I had found in the pantry behind a row of empty mason jars, a dark blue cloth-bound notebook in which she had recorded in her neat schoolteacher's hand every batch of jam and jelly and pickle she had put up from 1949 to 2003. And beside each entry she had written a word or two about the weather, or the price of sugar, or a thing my grandfather had said. And reading it was like hearing her voice in a quiet room. July 14th, 1953. 8 pints strawberry jam. Hot. Nils says the drought will break by Sunday. I hope he is right. August 2nd, 1967. 12 quarts. Dilly beans. Good year for beans. Willa's mother called the baby is walking. September 18th, 1979. 14 pints apple butter. Cold snap early. The co-op tried to drop the price, but I held firm. Vernon Keller's father backed down when I showed him the contracts from '76. That last entry made me sit up. I read it again. My grandmother standing up to the co-op chairman. My grandmother, who I had always thought of as quiet, as gentle as someone who made jam and sang hymns, had stood in a room full of men and held firm. I thought about that for a long time. The work on the house continued. Otis came most afternoons with his tools and his Tupperware containers of pickled beets, and once a pan of rhubarb crisp his sister had made. And he would work quietly beside us for a few hours and then leave without ceremony. He fixed the cracked window pane. He replaced the flapper valve in the toilet. He showed me where the main water shutoff was and told me a story about the winter of 1996 when the pipes froze and my grandmother had to melt snow on the stove for 3 days until the thaw came. He never asked about Barrett. He never asked why I was here. He simply treated me as though my presence in this house was the most natural thing in the world, and there was a kindness in that I did not know how to thank him for. One afternoon in late May, about 6 weeks after I had arrived, Otis came over with his usual Tupperware and a pan of rhubarb crisp. And after we had worked for a while on the garden fence that had fallen over in some long-ago storm, he sat on the porch steps and drank the coffee Josette had made, and he said, "Willa, have you been in the scoop shed?" I said, "Not properly." He said I would take a look. I said, "What am I looking for?" He said, "I do not know, but Brigitte was a woman who kept things." And he did not say another word about it. The next morning I went out to the scoop shed. It was a small building, perhaps 14 feet by 20, clad in weathered cedar shakes with a single door that had settled on its hinges and a little square window clouded with pollen. I had to push hard to get the door open. Inside it smelled of old wood and cranberry dust and linseed oil. The light came through the window in a single shaft and lit up the dust motes hanging in the air like a galaxy. My grandfather's wooden scoops hung on the wall, 6 of them in a row in different sizes. The oldest one dated 1921 in pencil on the handle. There were coils of rope and a stack of wooden harvest boxes and a bench with a vise on it, and under the bench a heap of burlap sacks that had once held seed. I stood in the doorway and I thought about my grandmother's last words. "Tell Willa the trunk is in the shed." I pulled the burlap aside. I did not know what I was looking for. I moved 2 sacks and then a third, and under the third sack pushed back against the wall was a tin trunk. It was the size of a small suitcase painted green once, but the paint was faded to the color of sage, with 2 leather straps buckled across the top and a small brass padlock on the hasp. It was heavier than I expected. I carried it into the house. I set it on the kitchen table. Josette came in from the garden with dirt on her knees and she looked at the trunk and she said, "Willa." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you have a key?" I said, "I think I do." I went to the parlor and I opened the canning journal, and I turned to the back. Taped to the inside of the back cover, where I had not noticed it in weeks of reading, was a small brass key on a twist of red ribbon. And under the key in my grandmother's neat hand were the words, "For Willa, when the time is right, you will know." I brought the key to the kitchen. My hands were not quite steady. Josette stood on the other side of the table, and she did not say anything. I put the key in the padlock. The padlock opened with a soft click that seemed very loud in the quiet kitchen. I unbuckled the leather straps. I lifted the lid. Inside the trunk, wrapped in a piece of red checked oilcloth, were 9 leather ledgers, the oldest dated 1947 and the youngest 1989. The record of 42 years of cranberry harvests on the Lindquist bog, every load, every price, every buyer, every frost warning, every sluice repair. I lifted them out carefully. The leather was soft and oil-stained, and the pages were filled with my grandmother's handwriting, neat columns of figures and notes, and I set them on the table in order. And I thought, this is the instruction manual. This is how she did it. Underneath the ledgers, in a velvet bag, the color of moss, were 12 gold coins, round and heavy and yellow as butter. I did not know what they were at first. I turned one in my hand. It had a woman's head on one side, Liberty with a coronet and an eagle on the other side, and the date on the one I held was 1901. And there were 11 more in different dates between 1879 and 1907. Double eagles, $20 gold pieces. All of them real, all of them warm in my palm, as though they had been waiting. I set them on the table, and Josette picked one up and turned it in the light. And she said very quietly, "Lord, have mercy." Underneath the velvet bag was an envelope. It was sealed, and on the front in my grandmother's hand was written, "For my granddaughter Willa, to be opened when you come home." I picked up the envelope. My hands were shaking now. I looked at Josette, and she nodded, and I opened it. Inside was a letter dated October 2004, which was 7 months before my grandmother died. The paper was good writing paper, cream-colored and heavy, and the handwriting was the same neat schoolteacher's hand I had been reading in the canning journal. But the ink was darker, more deliberate, as though she had written slowly, choosing each word with care. I read it out loud because I needed to hear it, and because Josette was there, and because I think my grandmother would have wanted someone besides me to witness this. "Willa," I read, "if you are reading this, the house is yours and I am gone, and you have come home, which I always believed you would, although I did not know when." My voice caught. I kept reading. "I want to tell you a few things plainly, because I am a plain woman, and my time for flourishes has passed. The bog is yours. It has been in my family for 3 generations, and it is not a thing I could give to anyone who did not come from it. Your cousin Lars is a good man, but he is a man of towns, and the bog needs a woman who remembers the water. You remember the water, Willa. I saw it in you when you were 6. I stopped. I could see myself at 6, walking the dikes with her, learning to tell a ripe berry from an unripe one, learning to read the sky for frost, and I had forgotten all of that. I had forgotten it completely in the years of being Barrett Morrison's wife. The coins are your grace money. Your grandfather and I saved them over many years, one at a time, from the good harvests. And we said to each other that they would be for the one of our blood who needed to start over. I do not know which of you it will be, but whichever of you finds this trunk, I want you to know that I watched you and I prayed for you and I trusted that the water would call you home when the time came. I had to stop again. Josette's hand was on my shoulder. Use the coins to start again. Do not use them to mourn. Mourning is free. The ledgers are yours too, so that you will know what a good year looked like and what a bad year looked like, and that both of them passed. The bog has given our family everything, Willa, and it has asked very little in return. Only hands and patience, and the sense not to flood it when the frost is coming. You have all three of those things. You do not know yet that you have them, but you do. Your grandmother loves you. Brigitte. I finished reading and I put the letter down on the table and I put my head down between my elbows and I cried in a way I had not cried for any of the 3 weeks after Barrett served me, or any of the 42 years before that. I cried for my grandmother, who had known somehow that one of us would break. I cried for the girl I had been at 6, who had loved this place and had forgotten. I cried for the 42 years I had spent trying to be someone else's idea of what a wife should be. And I cried because my grandmother had left me not just money, but a map, a way forward, a belief that I could do this. Josette stood at the other side of the table, and she put her hand on my shoulder, and she did not speak. And after a long time I sat up, and I wiped my face on my sleeve and I said, "Josette." She said, "I heard." I said, "What do I do?" She said, "Willa Lindquist, you do what the woman told you to do. You start again." We did not tell anyone at first. The trunk went under the iron bed in the back bedroom with the Afghan over it. The coins went into a small canvas bank bag inside the trunk. The letter stayed in the envelope, and the envelope stayed on the nightstand, where I could read it on the nights when I needed to, which was most nights for a while. The ledgers stayed on the kitchen table. I read them the way you read a mystery novel, looking for clues, looking for patterns, and what I found was a record of a life lived close to the earth, close to the weather, close to the small daily calculations that add up over time to survival. My grandmother had written everything down. The dates she flooded the bog, the dates she drained it, the dates the first frost came, and whether it was a killing frost or just a warning. The prices the co-op offered and the prices she negotiated. The names of the buyers who were fair and the names of the ones who tried to cheat. And in the margins, in that same neat hand, she had written notes to herself. Trust the sky, not the forecast. If Vernon Keller's father offers $3, ask for 4. The vines know more than you do. Watch them. I read those ledgers every night for a week, and by the end of the week I understood that what my grandmother had left me was not just a record of what had happened, but a guide to what could happen again. A week later, I drove into the town of Toma, about 40 minutes east, and I met with a woman named Solveig Esbensen, who had been recommended by Otis as the best appraiser in the county. She was 52, Norwegian-American, with hair the color of wheat and a straight, careful way of speaking. And she examined the coins in her back office with a jeweler's loupe and a velvet pad, and she weighed each one on a small brass scale, and she wrote the dates and the grades in a small notebook. After about 40 minutes, she set down the loupe, and she folded her hands on her desk. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, and I said, "Miss Lindquist now, please." She smiled a small smile. "Miss Lindquist, these are 12 genuine United States Liberty Head double eagles, minted between 1879 and 1907. In grades ranging from very fine to almost uncirculated. I would be comfortable valuing the set at today's market at approximately $42,000. Perhaps a little more if you chose to sell through a specialty auction house, but I would not recommend it. I would recommend a reputable dealer. I can give you 2 names." I nodded. $42,000. It was more than I had expected, more than I had hoped. And I sat in her office with the afternoon light coming through the window, and I thought about my grandmother and my grandfather putting aside 1 coin at a time, year after year, believing that someday someone would need them. I thanked her. I asked her if she would also look at the bog professionally and give me a sense of what a restored 40-acre cranberry operation might be worth in the Warrens market. And she said, "I am not a farm appraiser, but I know one." And she put me in touch with a man named Gerhard Nielsen from Black River Falls, who came out the following Tuesday in a mud-splashed truck and walked every dike with me for 3 hours. Gerhard did not talk much. He knelt in the vines. He turned over a mat of runners. He scraped at the dike with his boot. He pulled out a pH testing kit and took soil samples, and he walked the whole perimeter of the bog and checked the sluice gate and the pond at the east end and the drainage ditches. At the end of 3 hours, he stood by his truck, and he pulled off his cap, and he said, "Miss Lindquist, many of your vines are alive, dormant but alive. That is unusual after 11 years. Your grandfather did good drainage work. The sluice is functional. The pond at the east end is a good size." He put his cap back on. He said, "If you restored 3 acres as a test, and they produced at industry average, and you sold to the co-op, you would cover your operating costs the 2nd year. If the whole 40 were restored, and it would take you 5 or 6 years to get there, the operation at today's valuations would be worth conservatively $310,000, perhaps more." He paused. He said, "I would not advise doing it alone. I would advise doing it carefully." $310,000. I drove home slowly. I did not feel triumphant. I felt steady. There is a difference, and the difference matters. Triumph is a spike in the blood. Steady is a low, warm light under the sternum, and it lasts longer and it is harder to take away. Marigold drove up that weekend. My daughter was 40 years old, a tall, practical woman with her grandmother. Brigitta's jaw, and her father's eyes. And she worked as a school psychologist in Madison. And she had been the one who had called me every night for the 3 weeks in Chicago, and who had met me at the rest stop on I-94 with a thermos of chicken soup on moving day, and who had said, "Mom, I am on your side, and I am staying on your side, and I am not going to spend the next 10 years pretending Dad did something reasonable." She came up that weekend with her husband, Shell, who was a soft-spoken man who built wooden canoes on the weekends, and the two of them slept in the back bedroom, and on Saturday morning we all walked the bog together. Marigold cried. I had not expected her to. She stood at the edge of the pond and she looked across the dormant vines and she said, "Mom, Grandma used to bring me out here when I was 6. Do you remember?" I said, "I remember." She said, "She used to say, 'Marigold, this is the inheritance you do not see.'" I remember her saying that. I did not know what she meant. I said, "I think we are about to find out." We walked back to the house and I made coffee and I told Marigold about the coins. I told her about the ledgers. I told her about the letter and I let her read it on the porch in the afternoon light. And she read it twice and she folded it carefully and handed it back to me. And she said, "Mom, restore the bog." I said, 3 acres first. She said, 3 acres first. She said, "I will come every other weekend. Shell will help with the scoop shed. Josette will handle the paperwork. Otis will handle the co-op. You will handle the water." She looked at me. She said, "This is not your retirement. This is your beginning. Do you understand?" I said, "I am beginning to." Josette took over the paperwork with the relish of a woman who had spent 40 years in hospital administration and who was frankly delighted to have a reason to write firm letters. She registered the farm under my name with the county. She filed the grandfathered use certificate with the state agriculture department. She opened a small business checking account at the State Bank of Warrens, where the teller turned out to be Otis Holmesburg Van's great-niece, which surprised nobody but me. She filed the paperwork with the Wisconsin State Cranberry Growers Association. She sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee, and she said, "Willa, this is a business now. You are going to treat it like one. You are going to pay yourself a salary, even if it is small. You are going to keep receipts. You are going to file quarterly." I said, "Josette." She said, "Do not Josette me." I said, "Yes, ma'am." 3 weeks after I met with Gerhard Nielsen, I sold 3 of the gold coins to a reputable dealer in Madison. I kept 9. The dealer gave me $11,000 for the 3, which was, he said, a fair price given the condition. I deposited the $11,000 in the new business account. I used the first $3,000 to buy supplies for the 3-acre test restoration. I used another $2,000 to pay a young man named Axel Torvik, a 23-year-old neighbor's son who was studying agriculture at the Technical College in Wisconsin Rapids, to work with me on weekends. I put the rest in reserve. The 9 remaining coins along with the ledgers and my grandmother's letter stayed in the tin trunk under the iron bed. Some inheritances are for now. Some are for later. I had decided I would not spend the later in advance. The test restoration began in June. Axel and I walked the 3-acre section at the north end of the bog, the one with the best drainage and the liveliest vines, and we mapped it with stakes and twine. We cleared willow and alder from the dike. We repaired a section of the sluice with new oak planks. We mowed the mat of dormant runners gently with a blade my grandfather had bought in 1962, and that Otis had sharpened for me on his own grinder. I learned the names of things I had forgotten I had learned as a child. I learned the smell of wet peat on a warm morning. I learned the ache in my lower back at the end of a day, and the way that ache was, to my great surprise, a kind of friend. I learned that there are different kinds of tired, and the tired that comes from physical work is cleaner than the tired that comes from being someone you are not. Axel was a good teacher because he did not assume I knew nothing, and he did not assume I knew everything. He showed me how to read the vine growth, how to tell a healthy runner from a diseased one, how to adjust the water flow in the irrigation ditches. He showed me his grandfather's way of checking soil pH with a simple kit, and his own way of marking problem areas with colored flags so we could monitor them through the season. And he listened when I told him what my grandmother's ledgers said about frost timing and harvest windows, and he did not dismiss them as old-fashioned, which I appreciated. We worked weekends through June and into July. Marigold came every other weekend as promised, and she worked beside us, and Shell rebuilt the east wall of the scoop shed with cedar he had milled himself. Josette came up for another month in late summer, and she brought Reuben, who sat on the porch in a folding chair and read spy novels, and who surprised me by turning out to be a very good cook. And the 3 of us 4 when Marigold and Shell were there. 5 when Axel came lived in the farmhouse in a kind of easy rhythm that I had not expected at 69 to ever have again. Barrett called in July. He had not called in 9 weeks as I had asked, and I want to give him credit for that because he had always been in his way, a man who would do what was asked of him, if the asking was clear. The phone rang on a Tuesday evening. I was at the kitchen sink washing rhubarb for jam. Josette had gone back to Milwaukee for a week to check on Reuben and to make sure he had not turned the house into a disaster. I looked at the little screen on the wall-mounted phone, which I had kept old-fashioned on purpose, and I saw his name, and I watched it ring 4 times, and on the 5th ring I picked up. "Willa," he said. His voice sounded older than I remembered, which was strange because it had only been 4 months. He said, "Willa, I hope I am not interrupting." I said, "You are not." He said, "I wanted." He stopped. He tried again. He said, "I wanted to tell you I may have been hasty." He said that word carefully, as though it were a small glass object he was setting on a shelf. "I may have been hasty," he said. "Vivian and we are taking some time. Perhaps you and I could talk." I stood at the sink. The rhubarb was pink and cold under my fingers. I did not say anything for a long moment. I could hear his breath on the other end of the line, a little uneven, and I could hear faintly a television in the background, and I thought he is alone in the condo. He is alone in our condo, which is his condo, and he is afraid, and I am not the answer to his fear. I have been the answer to his fear for 42 years, and I will not be the answer to it for one more hour. I said, Barrett, I hope you are well. I am sorry for whatever is happening in your life. I wish you peace. I am not going to talk to you. Please do not call again. I did not say it cruelly. I said it the way you state a fact, the way you say the sky is blue or the coffee is hot. And then I said goodbye quietly, because I do not believe in slamming receivers, and I put the phone back on its cradle. And I finished washing the rhubarb, and I chopped it, and I put it in a pot with sugar. And I made 4 jars of jam, which I labeled Willa Lindquist, Warren's July in my grandmother's hand, as well as I could manage. And I went to bed, and I slept 7 hours, which was more than I had slept in any night in Chicago for about 3 years. The next morning, I took a postcard from the drawer of the parlor desk. It was an old one from a box my grandmother had kept for decades, a picture of the Warrens' Cranberry Festival from 1978. A little faded, a little ridiculous. I wrote on the back in my neatest hand, Barrett number, be well, you. I addressed it to his office, not to the condo, because I did not want Vivian, if Vivian was still there, to read it and feel wounded. I walked it to the mailbox at the end of the lane. I lifted the red flag. I walked back to the house. That was the last communication Barrett and I ever had. The summer of that first year is mostly in my memory, a summer of small things done well. I do not want to make it sound as though the bog came back overnight, because it did not. And I do not want to make it sound as though I was strong every day, because I was not. There were mornings I could not get out of bed. There were afternoons I sat on the porch and cried for no reason, or for the reason I had been trained to call. No reason, which was really the reason that I had been given away by a man I had given my life to, and that reason was allowed to walk around inside my body for as long as it needed to walk around. There were nights I called Marigold at 10 o'clock and said, "Tell me I am not a fool." And she said, "Mom, you are not a fool." And I said, "Tell me again." And she said, "Mom, you are not a fool." And that was usually enough. But mostly, the days were small and good. I learned how to weed a dike without pulling up the vines. I learned how to read the sky for frost in June, which is a different reading than in October. I learned how to listen to Otis when he came over in the evenings with a thermos of his own coffee, and sat on the porch and told stories about the co-op in the 1970s, about the drought of 1988, about my grandmother in 1979, when she stood down a buyer from Massachusetts who had tried to undercut the local price. I learned listening to him that my grandmother had been a formidable woman, and that I had known this as a child, and that I had forgotten it the way we forget everything about the women who shape us the minute we leave their houses, and that I was remembering it now the way you remember the words to a song your mother sang when you were 3. The vines grew. The season moved. The light changed from the harsh white of June to the softer gold of August. And I learned to mark time not by the calendar, but by the color of the sky and the height of the water in the pond, and the way the vines looked when the sun came up. I learned that I was good at this. Not expert, not yet, but good. I learned that my hands knew things my mind had forgotten. I learned that my body was stronger than I had given it credit for. And I learned slowly that I was not finished. That 69 was not an ending. That 69 was perhaps a comma, or better yet, a colon, and that what came after the colon was mine to write. The first harvest was the October of the second year. I am going to tell you about it because it was the day I will remember when I am 90 if I am given 90. And I think I will be given 90. And I think I will be given it largely because of that day. The preparation began in late September when the berries on the 3 test acres had ripened to the color of garnets, and the nights had begun to carry the first hint of cold. Axel and I had monitored the vines all summer, watching for disease, watching for pests, adjusting the irrigation. And now, in the final weeks before harvest, we watched the weather the way sailors watch the horizon. The decision of when to flood is the decision that makes or breaks a cranberry harvest. Too early and the berries are not ripe and the price drops. Too late and you risk frost damage or worse. My grandmother's ledgers were clear on this point. September 22nd, 1984. Flooded today. Later than I wanted, but the weather held. Trust the berries, not the calendar. October 1st, 1991. Flooded yesterday. Early, but a hard freeze is coming. Sometimes you flood for safety, not for ripeness. I read those entries over and over in the last weeks of September, and I walked the 3 acres every morning and every evening. And I looked at the berries and I looked at the sky and I tried to hear what my grandmother would have told me. On September 28th, Axel and I made the decision. We would flood on the 29th and let the bog sit for 10 days and harvest on October 9th. It was later than industry standard, but it felt right. The berries were dark and firm, and the weather forecast showed no hard freeze until at least the 12th. We had a window. On the morning of September 29th, we opened the sluice gate. The water came from the pond at the east end of the bog, cold and clear and brown-tinted from the peat, and it moved slowly across the 3 acres inch by inch, the way my grandmother had described in her ledgers, the way my grandfather had taught her the way it had been done for 3 generations. Axel and I stood on the dike and watched the water rise. It took 4 days to reach the right depth, 8 inches over the vines, and by October 3rd, the 3 acres were flooded, and the ripe berries had floated to the surface, and the whole rectangle looked like a field of rubies laid out under the sky. I stood on the dike that evening and I looked at what we had made, and I felt something in my chest that I had not felt in a very long time. Pride. Not the kind of pride that comes from being praised or recognized. The kind that comes from having put your hands to something and made it real. The weather held through the 4th and the 5th. Cold at night, warm in the day, perfect conditions. And then on the morning of October 6th, 3 days before we were scheduled to harvest, Axel called me at 6 a.m. His voice was tight. He said, "Willa, have you seen the updated forecast?" I had not. I turned on the radio to the AG report. The weather service was calling for an early hard freeze, possibly as soon as the night of October 7th, definitely by the 8th. Temperatures dropping to the low 20s. A killing frost. If it came before we harvested, the berries would freeze in the water, and the cell walls would rupture, and we would lose everything. 3 acres, $5,000 in investment, a year and a half of work, gone. I sat at the kitchen table with the radio playing, and I felt the fear move through me like cold water. Axel came over within the hour. Josette was there, having driven up the night before for the planned harvest weekend. Otis came over at 7 with his Tupperware of pickled beets and his thermos of coffee, and we all sat around the kitchen table and looked at the options. Option 1, harvest today, October 6th. We could call everyone, get the team together, work through the day and night if necessary. Get the berries off the bog before the freeze came. The problem was the berries were not quite ripe, maybe 90% ripe, maybe 95%, but not the full deep color that meant premium pricing. If we harvested early, we would get a lower grade, a lower price, maybe $3 a pound instead of $4, and on 1,400 pounds. That was the difference between breaking even and making a small profit. Option 2, wait. Trust. The forecast was wrong. Trust that the freeze would hold off harvest as planned on the 9th when the berries were at peak ripeness. The problem was obvious. If the freeze came early, we lost everything. Otis sipped his coffee and looked out the window at the flooded bog, and he said, "What do the ledgers say?" I went to the back bedroom and I brought out the ledgers and I paged through them looking for a similar situation. And I found it. October 1979. The entry I had read before about my grandmother standing up to the co-op chairman. But there was more. I read it out loud. October 5th, 1979. Weather service calling for early freeze on the 7th. Everyone at the co-op says harvest now. Vernon Keller's father came to the house personally to tell me I was a fool to wait. But I have been watching the sky, and I have been watching the water temperature, and I have been watching the vines, and I do not believe it. I believe the freeze will hold until the 9th. I am waiting. I turned the page. October 9th, 1979, harvested today. No freeze came. The weather service was wrong. Vernon Keller's father had to admit I was right. The berries are perfect. Sometimes you trust the instruments and sometimes you trust what you know. I set the ledger down. I looked at Axel. I looked at Josette. I looked at Otis. Otis said, "What does the water temperature say?" We walked down to the bog. Axel had a thermometer and he waded out to the middle of the flooded rectangle and he took a reading, 51 degrees. Cold, but not cold enough to freeze, even if the air temperature dropped to the low 20s. The thermal mass of the water would protect the berries for at least one night, maybe 2. I stood on the dike and I looked at the sky. It was blue and clear, and the wind was from the west, which in my grandmother's ledgers was always noted as a good sign. I said, "We wait." Axel said, "Are you sure?" I said, "No. But I am more sure of this than I am of the weather service." Josette said, "What if you are wrong?" I said, "Then I am wrong and we lose and we start over. But if I harvest out of fear instead of knowledge, I will never know if I could have done it the way my grandmother did it." Otis nodded. He did not say anything. He just nodded and went back to his truck and drove home. That night I did not sleep. I got up every 2 hours and I went out to the porch and I checked the thermometer and I looked at the sky. At midnight it was 41 degrees. At 2 a.m. it was 38. At 4 a.m. it was 35. Cold but not freezing. The wind stayed west and the sky stayed clear. And when the sun came up on the morning of October 7th, the air temperature was 33 and rising, and there was no frost on the grass. I called Axel. I said, "We made it through the first night." He said, "One more to go." The second night was worse. The temperature dropped faster. By 10 p.m. it was 36. By midnight it was 32. I stood on the porch at 2 a.m. and the thermometer read 29 degrees, and I could see my breath in the air. And I thought, this is it. This is where I was wrong. This is where I lose. But I went down to the bog anyway. I took a flashlight and I walked out onto the dike, and I shined the light across the water, and I could see a thin skin of ice forming at the edges where the water was shallowest. But in the center where the water was deeper, there was no ice. The berries were still floating. The thermal mass was holding. I went back to the house and I sat at the kitchen table with my grandmother's letter in front of me, and I read it again by lamplight. "The bog has given our family everything, Willa, and it has asked very little in return. Only hands and patience, and the sense not to flood it when the frost is coming. The sense not to flood it when the frost is coming. But I had already flooded it. The decision was made 10 days ago. All I could do now was wait and see if I had read the signs right. I made coffee. I sat at the table. I waited for morning. The sun came up at 6:17. By 7 a.m. the temperature was 35 and rising. By 8 it was 42. By 9 it was 48, and the thin ice at the edges of the bog had melted, and the berries were still floating perfect and red and untouched. I called Axel. I said, "We are harvesting tomorrow." He said, "I will be there at dawn." The morning of October 9th was the most beautiful morning I have ever seen. The sky was the color of a robin's egg, pale blue and cloudless, and the sun came up over the tamaracks at the east end of the property and laid itself across the water. And the water was so still. You could see the reflection of the sky doubled in it. And the berries lay on that doubled sky like a constellation. Axel was there at 6. Marigold had driven up the night before with Shell. Josette was there in rubber boots. We had bought her at the feed store. Otis was there in a pair of waders he had owned since 1972. Reuben was there in a brand new orange coat Josette had bought him because she said, "Reuben, you are not going to die in a bog looking like a thrift store." And my grandmother was there too, in her way, in the photograph on the parlor wall. and I felt her watching through the kitchen window, although I do not say that to anyone who did not grow up with bogs, because they do not understand. We went out into the water. I carried one of my grandfather's wooden scoops, the 1921 one which Otis had reconditioned for me over the winter. The water was cold. The cold went up my shins and into my knees, and it did not hurt the way I had thought it would. It felt instead like standing in a room my body remembered. Axel went ahead with the mechanical beater, a gentle one, the kind that loosens the berries without bruising them. And he walked slowly through the shallow water, and the beater churned, and the berries that were still attached to the vines came free and floated to the surface. Marigold and Shell worked behind him with Boom's long floating barriers that corralled the berries into a smaller and smaller area, concentrating them, making them easier to scoop. Josette stood on the dike with a clipboard, because Josette always stood on a dike with a clipboard, and she marked down the time and the temperature and the things she thought needed marking, and I loved her for it. Otis and I worked the scoops. The wooden scoop is a simple tool. It looks like a large wooden box with one side open and a long handle, and you push it through the water and the berries flow in, and you lift it and the water drains out through the slats, and what you are left with is 30 pounds of cranberries, wet and heavy, and the color of dark wine. You lift it and you carry it to the edge of the bog, and you dump it into a wooden harvest box on the bank. And then you go back and you do it again. We worked for 4 hours. My back ached. My shoulders burned. My hands were cold and wet and cramping on the handle of the scoop. And I did not care. I did not care because every time I lifted that scoop full of berries, I was doing what my grandmother had done, and what her father-in-law had done, and what 3 generations of Lindquists had done on this land. I was bringing in the crop. At noon, we stopped for lunch, for Josette had made sandwiches, and we sat on the bank and ate them and looked at the harvest boxes filling up on the grass. Otis said, "How many pounds do you think?" Axel said, "Maybe 1,300, maybe more." I said, "The ledgers said to expect 1,100 on a first harvest from 3 acres. Otis said, "The ledgers are usually conservative." We worked through the afternoon. The sun moved across the sky, and the shadows lengthened, and the water turned from blue to gold, to something softer. And at 4:30 p.m., we pulled the last scoop. We carried the harvest boxes to my grandfather's old scale, a large platform scale, with a mechanical dial that had been sitting in the scoop shed since 1989. Axel and Shell had cleaned it and calibrated it the week before. We weighed the boxes one by one. Josette wrote down the numbers. When we were finished, she added them up twice to be sure. She looked at me. She said, 1,400 pounds, 1,400 pounds, 300 pounds more than the ledgers had predicted, 300 pounds more than we had hoped. I sat down on the edge of the scale platform, and I put my face in my hands, and I did not cry, but I came very close. Axel said, "That is good, Willa. That is very good." Marigold came and stood beside me and put her hand on my shoulder, and she did not say anything. and she did not need to. We loaded the berries into Axel's truck. Wooden boxes stacked carefully in the bed covered with tarps. We drove them to the co-op in town, a large metal building on the edge of Warren's with the words, Warren's Cranberry Cooperative, painted on the side in faded red letters. Inside the co-op was all concrete floors and stainless steel, and the smell of fruit and water. A woman named Ingrid Solhaug was working the intake station. She was 78, tall and lean, with white hair pulled back in a bun, and she had known my grandmother. She looked at me when I came in and she smiled and she said, "Brigida's granddaughter, I heard you were back." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Let us see what you brought." Axel and Shell unloaded the boxes onto the intake platform. Ingrid took samples from 3 different boxes. She examined them for color, for firmness, for size. She ran them through the sorting machine to check for rot or damage. She tested the sugar content with a refractometer. She did all of this slowly and carefully, and without speaking, and I stood there with my hands in my pockets and my heart beating hard, and I waited. Finally, she wrote something on a form, and she brought it over to me. She said, 1,400 pounds, grade A, premium quality. I looked at the form. I looked at her. I said, grade A. She said, grade A. Your berries are as good as any I have seen this year. Better than most. Your grandmother would be proud. And then Ingrid Solhaug, who was 78 years old and who did not say much, walked around the counter and put her hand on my arm and said, "Brigida would be proud of you, Willa." I could not speak. I nodded. I took the form and I walked outside, and I stood in the parking lot in the late afternoon sun, and I cried for the second time in my life, in public. The first time being when Marigold was born, and the nurse handed her to me. Marigold came and stood beside me, and she did not say anything. She just stood there. And after a while, I stopped crying and I wiped my face on my sleeve and I said, "We did it." She said, "You did it, Mom." I said, "No, we did it. You and Shell and Josette and Otis and Axel and me and your grandmother and your great-grandfather and everyone who has ever put their hands to this land. We did it." We drove back to the farmhouse in the truck with the empty harvest boxes rattling in the bed. The sun was setting. The light was long and gold, and it turned the fields to amber and the sky to rose. And I thought, this is what contentment looks like. This moment right here. This light, this road, these people. Back at the house, Josette had made pot roast. She had been cooking it in the oven all afternoon while we worked, and the whole house smelled of meat and carrots and the rosemary she had found growing wild by the shed. Marigold had made apple pie from the recipe in my grandmother's canning journal, a recipe I had not cooked in 20 years, and which Marigold had apparently been practicing in secret for weeks. Reuben made the gravy. Shell poured wine. Otis brought a bottle of aquavit his cousin had sent from Minnesota. We sat at the long kitchen table under the yellow overhead light, and we ate and we talked, and we did not say a toast. because my family is not a family that toasts. But at one point, Otis raised his little glass of aquavit, and he looked at me across the table and he said, "Willa." I said, "Yes, Otis." He said, "Welcome home." And that was the toast. We talked late into the evening. Josette told stories about her granddaughter who had just started college. Reuben told a story about the time he delivered mail in a blizzard in 1987. Shell talked about the canoe he was building and how the ribs were bent from white cedar and steamed into shape. Marigold talked about a student she was working with, a girl who reminded her of herself at that age. And Otis told us about the co-op in the old days, about the farmers who had worked the bogs before the big operations took over. About my grandmother standing in a co-op meeting in 1979 and refusing to accept a low price and walking out when they would not meet her terms and coming back the next week when they called to apologize. I listened to all of it. I listened, and I thought about how strange it is that you can spend 42 years of your life in one place and then discover that the place you needed to be was somewhere else entirely, somewhere you had left behind, somewhere you had forgotten. And I thought about Barrett in the condo in Chicago alone, or with Vivian, or with someone new, and I did not feel anger. I felt something closer to pity, because he had spent 70 years building a life that looked impressive from the outside. And he had never once asked himself if it felt real on the inside. And I had spent 69 years trying to fit into that life, and it had taken losing everything to discover that I did not fit, because I was not meant to. We cleared the dishes. Josette washed and I dried, and Marigold put things away, and the men sat on the porch and smoked cigars that Otis had brought for the occasion. And when the kitchen was clean, I went upstairs to the back bedroom and I took the tin trunk from under the iron bed and I brought it downstairs and I set it on the parlor floor. I opened it. I took out the 9 remaining gold coins and I held them in my hand. I thought about my grandmother and my grandfather putting them aside one at a time, year after year, believing that someday someone would need them. I thought about the letter. Use the coins to start again. Do not use them to mourn. Mourning is free. I had used 3 coins to start. I still had 9. I did not need them now. The harvest had brought in enough to cover the operating costs and to begin planning the restoration of another 7 acres next year. The 9 coins were for later, for the years when the harvest failed, for the emergency that would inevitably come, for the grace I did not yet know I would need. I put them back in the velvet bag. I put the bag back in the trunk. I closed the lid. Some inheritances are for now. Some are for later. That night I slept deeper than I had slept since I was a child. I want to tell you the last things because they matter. I want to tell you what I have come to understand. Sitting on this porch at 74, looking out over a bog that is now fully restored, all 40 acres over 4 years, with the help of Axel and Marigold and Josette and Otis and a young woman named Astrid Nielsen, who is Gerhard's granddaughter and who has come to work with me 3 days a week and who I am training gently in the way I was trained. Because the bog needs a woman who remembers the water, and I will not always be that woman, and the next one has to be ready. I want to tell you that 69 is not a finished sentence. I want you to hear me on that. When Barrett served me the papers, I believed in the deepest part of me that my life had just been closed. The way a book is closed, the way a file is closed, the way the lid of a coffin is closed. I believed that a woman of 69 who had given 42 years to a marriage and who was given in return a manila folder and a transitional allowance was a woman who was finished, and that the rest of her years were a cooling down, a long, slow exhalation, a waiting. I was wrong. I was so wrong that I am almost embarrassed for the woman I was, except that I will not be embarrassed for her because she had been taught to believe what she believed. And she believed it in good faith. And she did what she could with what she had been told. I do not think 69 is a finished sentence. I think 69 is the colon at the end of the first half of a sentence, and the second half is what you decide to write. And you may have less time to write it than you had to write the first half. But that does not mean the second half is less. It means the second half is more concentrated, more deliberate, more yours. I want to tell you that grandmothers sense the future. I do not say that to be sentimental. I say it because it is something I have seen now with my own eyes. My grandmother Brigitta in October of 2004 sat down at her kitchen table. This kitchen 7 months before her own death. And she wrote a letter to a granddaughter she had not seen in 2 years. And she put 12 gold coins in a velvet bag. And she put the velvet bag in a tin trunk. And she buried the trunk under burlap in a scoop shed. And she did all of this because she knew somehow in her Swedish, Danish, American bones that one of her blood would come home broken and would need grace money to start again, and that the one who came home would be me. She did not know which of us it would be, but she knew one of us, and she prepared for that one quietly in her 80s without telling a living soul, and she left the key in her canning journal for us to find. I do not know how she knew. I think women of her kind knew things we have forgotten how to know. I think if we listen, we can learn to know them again. And I want to tell you finally about marriages and bogs. I have thought about this a lot. A marriage, I have come to think, asks you to give. That is not a complaint. That is what a marriage is. A good marriage asks you to give, and it asks your partner to give. And the two of you give and give. And the giving is mutual. And the giving is good. And the giving builds something larger than either of you. A marriage like mine, as it turned out, asked me to give without asking Barrett to give equally. And I did not see that for 42 years. And when I finally saw it, it was because he stood up and he handed me a folder. And he told me I was no longer required to give and I was free. A bog does not ask you to give. A bog asks you to tend. There is a difference. When you tend a bog, you do not pour yourself out. You show up. You watch the water. You listen for frost. You weed the dikes. You let the vines do what the vines are going to do. And in October, the bog gives back. It gives back ruby berries and cold water, and a wooden scoop heavy with fruit, and a receipt with your name on it, and a neighbor saying, "Welcome home." A bog gives back more than you put in. That is what a bog is. That is what it has always been for women in my family for 3 generations. And it is what it was for me. And I think it is what land always is when you tend it honestly. And I think it is what a life can be too. In the second half, if you are lucky. And if you listen, and if you have a grandmother who buried a trunk for you in a shed. I am 74 years old now. I live in my grandmother's red clapboard farmhouse on 40 acres of cranberry bog outside Warrens, Wisconsin. And I am not married, and I am not lonely. And I am not finished. I have a daughter who calls me every Sunday, and a friend who writes me letters from Milwaukee in a blue pen, and a neighbor who brings me pickled beets, and a young woman I am training, and a scoop shed that does not lean anymore, and a screen porch that does not sag, and a kitchen floor of wide pine boards that I installed myself with Shell's help, and I have a tin trunk under an iron bed with 9 gold coins still in it, and 9 leather ledgers and 1 letter from a dead woman who loved me more than I understood at the time. The sun is setting over the bog right now as I write this. The water on the eastern rectangle is the color of a lit lamp. The frogs are starting up in the ditch by the road. I'm going to go inside soon and make myself a cup of tea and sit on the sofa under my grandmother's crocheted afghan, which still smells faintly of cedar after all these years. And I am going to read a chapter of a book before I sleep. And I am going to think, as I often do now, of the morning in the North Shore condominium, when Barrett slid the folder across the granite island, and I poured my coffee, and my hand did not shake, and something inside my chest said, "Warrens." And I listened. If you are listening tonight and you are where I was, I want to leave you with this. The door has not closed. The key is not in anyone else's pocket. Your grandmother or your mother or your aunt or some woman of your blood buried a trunk for you somewhere. Even if it is only a trunk of things she taught you, without naming them, and your job at whatever age you are is to go find it. You will know the key when you see it. You will know the water when you stand in it. You will know your own home when the door swings open and the afternoon light lays itself down on the pine floor in a long golden stripe, and the smell of cedar rises up to meet you, and a small steady voice inside your chest that you had forgotten you had says, "Oh, I am home." Good night from Warrens. The cranberries are asleep under the water. The porch light is on. The afghan is warm. And I am at last exactly where I was always meant to be.